We're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects today, which is data analytics. As we heard earlier, we were talking about all the data. Data is useless unless you get the right analytics off of it. And the right analytics is useless unless the right culture is embracing it. Otherwise, it can be very dangerous. We were chatting for a little bit before the session, and I think we all agreed that it can actually be a very dangerous thing if you don't have the right culture and the right training and so on in place. So with that as a quick introduction, let me have each of the speakers introduce themselves briefly, and then maybe give a few comments on the things we were talking about earlier. I'm going to really bug you guys to be interactive, because I know this is an area you've got a lot of questions about. We don't have presentations, so we're up here to have an interactive discussion. Please.
Hi, I'm Jan Raoul from Gopili. To introduce myself, I would like to just talk about what is data analytics and what is data. A good performance analytics system relies on data, but what is data? It's information between two systems, so it's kind of language. So you have to have a standardized language in order to have a performance data. And there are some companies, like IATA in the past, in the airline industry, which created these standards. But we work in the ground transportation area. And in the ground transportation area, when we prepared this event, I had a look at how many different standards we have in the rail and the bus industry. We took 10 players in the industry, and we checked how many standards, how many kinds of data formats there was. And there was not one format, not two formats. In fact, from the 10 different players, there was not 10 formats, there was 12 formats. That means players, even internally, don't share the same standards to define what is a station, what is a carrier. And this creates a big mess when you want to aggregate this data and create value from this data. So this is what we do. In fact, we created a pivot format, and we created a meta search, which aggregates the data from the different carriers, and we provide this meta search to our audience. So we drive an audience of travelers of 7 countries in Europe. And Gopili and Calbillet, the French brand, are our brand for providing services to find the right options by train, rail, bus, ride sharing, and also flights from a city to another city.
All right. Well, for me, to introduce myself, I'm Andrei Grinchenko. I work for IATA, and I'm looking after a projects portfolio within our business intelligence department. I mainly look right now at some of the data products or data analytics that we provide to travel agencies. Before doing that, and I've been doing it for about a year and a half, I've mainly been involved with our financial settlement systems. So that's my background.
Okay, let me start out, and if we start having microphone problems, I'll move away from them. I'll look to you guys back there to see. Let's start out with the audience. How many of you guys belong to an organization you consider to be analytically driven? Why? Anyone want to offer any thoughts? Can we get a microphone? Thank you very much. Can we get a microphone down here? And let me start out at the very front, the gentleman here. There are many different types of analytically driven companies, so the answer is not going to be the same for everyone. Identify yourself, please. Thank you.
So my name is Tomas. I work for Amadeus, and I think we are a data insight-driven organization because basically we have set up all the main ingredients in order just to build top-notch products in the futures. So let's say is that in our case we are putting emphasis on the, let's say, on the MDM programs. That for us is pretty relevant. And we are making a data inventory about which is our current capabilities, and about that to try to identify which will be the future use cases in the company to serve our customer. And all of that will be supported by a big data platform, but that will be, or it is, let's say, shaping to avoid the data silos, to improve the operational intelligence, and obviously as well for data and discovery, in order to enhance the analytical models to put into production in the transactional system. So I think is that we're doing the right steps. And of course, we are just trying to identify which are the new roles and responsibilities, and to try to create different models to map in which is the level of maturity in terms of data and analytics of all our products. And I think this is the basic that you have to kickstart when you want to become a data-driven organization.
Okay, and this is at an enterprise level?
Yes.
You guys are doing?
Yes, of course. This
Okay.
is,
If you guys want to comment on anything, jump in. I'm just going to keep.
Well, I guess from IATA's perspective, I would like to consider ourselves as a data company as well. And well, we're involved in data in a lot of different areas. I mean, from standards to having our own analytics-driven sort of decision making, say in risk management or what have you. But then also we do collect and aggregate data on behalf of airlines. So we're kind of getting into a few different streams where we get not only across data, but we also gain experience in terms of how to work with it, how to manage it, and also get a view of different organizational cultures, predominantly, of course, with the airlines community that participate in certain data programs.
They can be quite different. What I've picked up from both of you is structure, that the analytical approach is creating, maybe I'm reading into, but it's a foundation. It's creating the right structure to getting the right data in the right places to support the right kind of decision making. So is that fair to say that it's all about creating a structure for analytics?
Well, I think definitely, yeah. I think definitely that's one of the key cornerstones of moving in becoming an analytics company. I mean, having data-driven decisions, I guess the good thing about it is it kind of takes emotion out of making decisions, and it makes decisions a lot more structured and a lot more, I guess, rational. On the other hand, and I think it was mentioned, well, you've mentioned that earlier, is it could be quite dangerous if you don't have a proper organizational culture, because data is, well, basically, as they say, if you torture it enough, it's going to confess to anything. So unless you have right people working with the right tools, with the right mindset, then you could have those rational decisions, which are actually silly decisions, simply because data wasn't really prepared enough, or wasn't really worked well into being business consumable.
From data to information.
Precisely.
Structure of data is key, but yeah, sometimes it's very hard to know how to structure the data. In the last panel, we were talking about soft data. There is no clear standard about how to say, okay, there will be some strike, how you will structure that, and what will be the impact on the business. And a lot of things which are not really part of the classical kind of data in the industry. In fact, over the structure, I think that there are 5 main challenges to organize the data to have a good performance analytics platform. The first is about the volume, how to manage the volume. And as Leo said, to introduce the conference, only 0.5% of data is really used. So that means there is 99.5% of data which are useless. Or maybe we keep it because we don't know what we want, what we will get from this data in the future. But this data also requires a lot of treatment, a lot of quality treatment, and this leads to the second challenge, which is reliability. And this consumes a lot of energy, at least in our company, because we aggregate data from different sources, including external sources, and you cannot really always rely on the quality of this data. And sometimes the gap between the data they bring you and what the other tracking we use create data where the difference is sometimes 20% difference. For example, in our business, we drive users from our meta search engine to our partners' websites for the transaction. So we don't perform any transaction on our system. And when we integrate, so we have our own internal tracking system, but we also work with external tracking system and our clients' tracking system. And when we do the report, the monthly report of the number of clicks and number of transactions, obviously there is no similar numbers. And sometimes the gap is 5%, so we consider it's okay, but sometimes it's 20%. So in a world, our industry, we have something like 2 or 3 or maximum 5% margin. So if you have a 20% error margin in a 5% business margin, it just kills the business. So it's very important to work on the reliability, and the less data you have, the more effort, the more efficient the effort is.
Any comments? Yeah, if we can get a, thank you. If we can get a microphone up here. And then I want to touch on something later, which is this data we're not using and whether we should be collecting it or not. Let her go ahead first. Thank you, Al.
Hi, I'm Pamela Whitby. I'm the editor of EyeforTravel. Jan, I just wanted to ask you, so what exactly are you doing to make the data more reliable? What sort of measures can you take? What are some of the sort of things you're doing as a business?
So what we do is that first we created our own internal system. So that means we trust what we do much more than what we buy or what the external partners give us as data, because there is a lot of loss of information during the data processing. And so to be very clear, we also have created some alerts when there are some data, when the data error is too large. We have some alerts to just let us know that maybe there is a problem somewhere. And so these are the main things we do. And what we did, in fact, is that we just focused on the minimum, on the main KPIs. We just, for all the data which is unsure, we don't mix it with the reliable data. We store it in a place, and we use it, but just as is. And all the decisions we took from aggregated data is only based on reliable data. So we can have some insights from unreliable data.
Jude wanted to make.
Well, I guess maybe we're a bit luckier in a way that we deal with industry data, because most of the data that we deal in terms of distribution and sales is based on relatively rigid standard. So it makes it, I guess, a little cleaner at the entry point. But there's still a lot of work and a lot of effort that is spent on cleansing it and normalizing it before it can actually be aggregated and be consumed. And much like Jan mentioned, we also have certain procedures in place that we compare our data with other sort of sources or different other market information, so that we get to a certain minimal margin of error. But as I said, I think we are in a bit of a better position simply due to a relatively high degree of standardization.
Any other questions or comments? Let me throw something out, and we had spoken about it earlier, and we're touching on it now. One of the worst positions in an analytically driven company is I say something, you say you think differently, and I ask you where your data is, you have a different data source than I do. Conversation over. There's no way to get anywhere. So I'm building a springboard here for us to talk about. It's not having siloed data, it's having one version of the truth. Go ahead, you're going to shake your head off.
Yeah, no, I was just, I totally agree. I mean, having fragmented data, having data from multiple sources, or same data from multiple sources is probably one of the worst nightmares, because, as you say, a conversation is over the minute you start it. Now, having one single source of truth, or agreed baseline source of truth, is, I think, of paramount importance in any sort of conversation which is data-based, because otherwise it will make no sense. And I mean, it's probably difficult to agree on a single source of truth, but I think this is probably one of the first conversations that anybody should really have when they're moving towards being sort of data-driven or analytics-driven. And I think that would go for both, whether it's internal data that is collected across organization and across different silos and sort of flowed into maybe some sort of centralized hubbing where it's normalized and cleansed and so on. But it could also be true for industry data. It's probably more difficult for industry data simply because it's more difficult to agree between different parties as to what should be considered a single source. But I think that really is something that everybody should very seriously consider.
I saw a bunch of heads shaking when we were talking. Does anyone have any comments or any examples? I mean, I've been there. I've been in the meetings where I have different data than someone else and you can't continue. But let's be real. We can have the same data source and have different inferences or results from it. So one thing in companies I've worked with have said is that you have to be able to explain, go ahead, get the mic up here. You have to be able to explain what you did and why you came up with your conclusions. Please.
How do you handle incomplete data? So when you know that at certain points in time, the amount of data that you have may not be complete, but you expect it to become more complete as time goes on. Is that something that you're able to communicate through your models or whatever back to the end user?
Do you want to, I can go ahead.
Well, at IATA, surely we do have some data that is maybe missing from the overall industry sets, and we do use different methodologies to sort of come up with whatever gaps that we know that there are. However, what we do to make sure that we're all on the same baseline is that we communicate where those gaps are, and we communicate what those gaps not only represent in terms of percentages, for example, of coverage, but also in terms of what are the potential sources of those gaps. And okay, it's not ideal. Surely it would be ideal to have a complete data set for the entire market or the entire international traffic. It's simply impossible at this point. And I think the next best thing is to make sure that everybody is 100% clear and 100% on the same page as to exactly what those gaps are and why are they there. That kind of helps to still use data with whatever assumptions that you need to take.
Do we have data scientists in the room? Are there any people here? Okay, keep me honest, say yes or no, whatever. I'm going to try to get you guys involved in this now. That's kind of your job. The people gathering the data is what it is. But in building the models that are using it, I know in revenue management, we used to have confidence intervals on the forecast, and it would show it that way. So you guys are shaking your head. I'm not going to point to anyone, but does anyone want to comment on this? But that's the data scientist that builds the models, that recognizes. You still have to, I think, use the data and do analytics, but you want to build in somehow the fact that there was some data missing here. Anyone want to? Thank you. I wasn't going to point at you, but I could see it.
Hi, I'm Mark Shilton from Skyscanner, and yeah, I'm a data scientist. I feel like I'm in some sort of therapy session saying that.
Like
I agree, and it's something that there's always kind of it's part of like having the culture of of data in the company as well. I think is that. Almost, if you can start talking about confidence limits and ranges, and then you're on the right track, because then at least you're giving people as kind of, rather than being these kind of people in the corner that come up with the model, and that's the model, and people don't really engage with it. They just want the number, and I want to know that you can have a conversation and say, this is the range, this is what the model's saying. So then you can take an idea of what kind of risk you're taking when you're going to have this. And yeah, we have certain decisions. Maybe you don't have enough data. So being able to say, well, this is a model built on these pretty wide-ranging assumptions. This gives you a pretty big range of pretty big range we're putting our kind of results in, So that's then up to you to then make the decision based on how much risk you're willing to kind of take. So if we're looking at spending millions and millions of dollars on something, millions of euros on something, then yeah, we're going to want to talk about having those ranges tighter. But at least that, and in a way, it gives us as data scientists a bit more. It makes it easier to have that conversation, because rather than saying this is the number, and then when that number doesn't turn out to be true, it's like, well, why wasn't the number true? At least if you're talking in ranges, then it's a bit easier to have that conversation. It's kind of, I guess I was about to ask a question as well around that. Was like we kind of talked about. You're talking there about how really wanting to have a single version of the truth, and I totally agree. That's the ideal. But I've never worked in an organization. I don't know if anyone else has where that is ever completely the truth, right? So I guess my question was around that is like, where would you put it? It's always like a continuum, right? There's a single version of the truth and there's total chaos. And we all kind of exist somewhere in the middle, because if it's a single version of the truth, you tend to, what that often, I think, in my experience, tends to mean is that people are less likely to completely engage with the data, because they're one step removed if you've got a team kind of tightly holding on to that data. So you want to give people access to that data, but the more you do that, the more you risk people coming up with some wacky metric that may or may not help you. So I guess my question would be, where do you sit on that continuum of chaos to complete and utter control of data, and why?
Personally, from my experience, let me address first the concept of a single version of truth. My truth may be different from your truth because of the way I'm looking at it. The marketing department may have a very different look at a forecast model than RM because of what it's doing with it. So you have to understand that. Where I think the transparency is needed is that you need to be able to explain your version of the truth and how you arrived at it. Because you may enlighten me. I may suddenly go, I never thought of it that way. But just saying that's my data or that's my result without being able to explain it in an analytically driven company leads to chaos. Does that make sense? So in the companies I'd worked with, it was this way. They basically said, and it also takes care of the other point you brought up, which is making people, the data accessible to people to use. People were told, if you use this data, you have to be able to defend what you did with it. That's part of the analytically driven culture. I'm not offensive to you if I say, explain that. Show me the steps you went through. It becomes objective and transparent and de-emotionalizes it. Do you guys have any?
In fact, when on the same data, you can have different interpretations on the data, and depending on the skills, depending on the people, but also depending on the question. What is the question? What do you want to answer from this data? And sometimes the answer is not the right one. So you have to change the answer to find the right question. In fact, when you do that, you do half the work on the data analysis by finding the right question. And sometimes, if you are managing as a company or as a department, you can have some idea about how it works, but it's interesting to create a work group on defining the right questions in order to find the right answers and to align all the team on the same indicators.
Yeah, I think it's also an organizational question and a management question. I think Fabrice was mentioning earlier this morning that he's attempted to provide, say, data access throughout the entire organization, but he had to withdraw it and go back to dashboard reporting. So to my mind, it's also a question of each individual organization sort of assessing its own degree of maturity before either allowing or democratizing certain access to data, or sticking to more sort of static reporting, or do some sort of progressive plan as to how to transition from one another, because otherwise you can find yourself in trouble, as in even defending your own version of truth. It sometimes could boil down to whoever screams loudest. is the right one. So it's a bit of a philosophical question, I understand, and we're always going to be somewhere in the middle. But as you say, there is this one single source of the truth, nirvana, and then there's total chaos. But everybody has to assess its own particular place in that journey.
You guys ever heard the saying, change is great as long as you don't change me or my organization? One solution I've found, we've done a lot of analytical centers of competence for large companies where they've asked us to come in and do this. One thing we found that had a resounding impact was to create one analytics team in the company. And man, did that wrench some people around. Marketing was used to having its analytics. Operations was used to having its group. If you create one group, a couple of things we found, they fed off each other. It was like the old Wizard of Oz movie when the little people all got together on the set. Supposedly, I've never seen anyone like you. Revenue managers of the same complex were kept siloed off when you get a group of revenue managers together. But the idea is these analytics people will start talking with each other. And the cross-pollination that happens about projects they're working on in different parts of the company, the whole analytics organization starts growing. And these guys aren't tortured serfs that are kept by some leader to prove their points and torture the data until, and that also helps create this sense where the analytics is believed in, because it didn't come out of the marketing department, it came out of the analytics group. Crazy?
I would probably vouch for it from my experience and from how we're approaching it within our organization. Because as I said, we do provide aggregated data to the marketplace, but we also obviously have our own data that we deal with and that we use for internal purposes. And we've gone through a similar experience of establishing an analytics team with our risk management operations and billing and settlement plan operations. And I think that kind of created a lot of interest, a lot of good vibe. As in, it was actually an independent team looking at it, which wasn't really controlled, if you wish, by any of the forces that were pulling in their own kind of ambition-driven direction. And I think that's probably a very good approach, as in crystallizing an independent sort of data organization, if you wish, within an organization, serving internal customers with their data needs. Builds trust, I think.
The day after conferences, people go back and go, that was a great idea. I'm going to ask my management about it. And with something like this, they suddenly go, how am I going to justify it? The reasons I've worked with companies that have justified it saves cost. You're not spreading analytics resources across a company. You can consolidate them. Number two, it gives these people a career path where they can see there's an organization and a structure and a focus. So just throwing that out there in case you want to float it when you get back to your companies. Is there anything, we've got about 5 minutes left, is there anything that we haven't covered? So we've kind of jumped around on this, but hopefully it's been beneficial. Any questions or final things to, back here please?
Hello, my name is Dmitry. I'm from tutu.ru. It's one of the biggest OTAs in Russia. So, talking about analytics, so we made the same, actually. So we have several products. We have 5 products. And we used to have separate analytics. But after that, we found out that we used to do everything by ourselves. And we found out that the data from outside, it's not reliable. And that question about reliability of external data is actually from me. So what we did, we created the separate data science or data engineering department. And right now we have like a star structure. So it's centralized and all data analysis, it's separated and driven, it's under CEO actually. So they're totally separate and they're driving the decisions. But what we found out actually that we had to make a step back and left our analysts product analytics in products. because the matter of context is very important. And what we found out that right after you make your analytic guy independent, he loses, let's say, half of his capacity without the context. And the question actually is how to connect. Maybe you have an answer how to enrich the capacity of this data analysis and to turn around the knowledge inside. So, for example, who is the final, let's say, customer from inside, finally?
To comment on what you've said, and there's an analogy again back with revenue management. Those guys used to report to the GMs and properties. In some places they still do, but they found that they weren't objective and they weren't independent enough. So they created central clusters of revenue management people. Then they found that that wasn't getting the vibe of what was going on in the property. So these people, and then the analytic structures we've built, they're embedded back down in the organizations, but they don't report to them. And that gives them the freedom and the independence to do what they think is correct, and gives them someone to report up to if they're being tortured into coming up.
And actually coming back to your comment about the truth, that there are a lot of truths, let's say. Finally, it's a hypothesis, and finally you can experiment and just check it out, how it goes. That's it.
And it'll be different by organization. I think I'm getting signals back there. I think we've got a minute or two to end up. And I've totally ignored the questions back here because I can't see them. I apologize. But like before, you can find us individually. I see you're looking at them, Andreas. You want to answer any of them? We've got a second or two.
Right. Well, I see a question there also about APIs, which I think had transpired through a previous session as well. I think, that's very, very important. I guess having API access to data, but at the end of the day, API is just, I guess, a way of communicating and a way of extracting data. But at the end of it, you're still looking at data quality, data reliability, and a willingness of certain organizations to release their data or to share data. So to my mind, APIs are probably secondary to all the data subjects that have to be resolved first. And then how you communicate it to the outside world, how you're opening up subscription to whatever data sources that you want to, is probably more of just a technicality question as opposed to anything else.
Are there any questions there that interest you?
Yeah, we faced, in fact, the same problem than you by knowing how to organize the data, the quality, and the analytics in the company. And in fact, we really strongly believe that it has to be embedded in every single department and every vertical in the company, in the team, and to make everyone aligned, we have to design common concepts to be sure that everyone is speaking the same semantics when they talk about something. What is a client? What is a visitor? What is a session? What is a sale? And once you've done that, it's much easier to gather data after that. Just maybe for management or.
Any final quick thoughts, because we're right at the timeline.
There's another interesting question up there, which is what other industries outside of travel can we learn from? And I think there are quite a number of industries which may have gotten to a bit higher level of maturity around their data management practices. And one that comes to mind is certainly pharmaceutical research and healthcare research. Because they do collect mass amounts of data, extremely sensitive data, but they did find ways of not only managing it correctly, but also sharing across competing organizations for the better good, I guess, of the entire industry. And I find that's quite fascinating. So I would definitely say that. I find that insurance and risk management industries are also quite advanced in the way that they work with data, because for them it's not just about top line, and for them it's about survival. So I would probably, put my eye on those two to get some learnings out of it.
Final thought?
Yeah, just about keep it simple.
Okay, we appreciate your time. Hopefully this was useful. It's a huge area. And as we get more and more data, this is going to become more and more complex. The one thing I would say, get some good data scientists. That's really a position of the future. Okay, thank you very much. We think we have another panel starting on connecting the data dots. Thank you to our speakers. Great job.